Hi, welcome to the Fennel Shed. I'm here today to show you how to make the first set of blocks that will be the first 4 blocks of our new Grianan quilt, the block of the month that's going to carry us through winter and into spring of 2022. And these first blocks are known as the Crossroads blocks, and they're like the shoulders of the quilt. This will be the centre of the quilt, and these sit on the 4 corners around the centre. And I call it the Crossroads because the composition is made up of many variations on the classic 4 patch, which is essentially a crossroads. So come with me now as I go to my cutting board and I show you all the elements that go into making that block. And here you can see all the fabrics that we will be using as we go through the quilt. There are 8 fabrics plus the sashing, and they go from ivory, the lightest, right through to a deep navy with a blue scroll on it, and that's going to be our range. If you remember, there's 8 fabrics ranging from light to dark, then that's the key to the colour combination that works in the quilt. Right, so I have now put together all the elements, the pieces of fabric, cut pieces that are needed to make this block. You'll get your sheet that will tell you exactly the measurements and how to cut. My advice on cutting is always to cut the biggest pieces first. So the biggest element of this is here, 2 large squares, 6 and 7/8. That'll make this large half square triangle. Then after that, we have another pair of squares that are used to make these little small guys down here. And we have quite a number of 3.5-inch squares of the plain background fabric. We have the little tiny one that sits in there. And the rest of these 4 patches are made using a technique that I've developed myself for making small sized 4 patches, using initially strips, stitched together, pressed together, and then subcut to make the 4 patches. So I'm going to show you now the marking that you need to do before you sew these guys. So in terms of marking, the biggest one needs to be marked once across the diagonal. You can use a pencil, you can use a chalk. This chalk is a lovely clear thing, and you need to get this absolutely correct. If your diagonal line isn't spot on the diagonal, you'll have one square that is bigger than the other, and you will never end up with the right size of blocks. So take your time and mark with care, and after you've marked, put in a couple of pins so that the fabrics don't slide about while you're sewing them. So that's those prepared. The next one is to make the small sized half square triangles, and we make these in sets of 8. And again, your instructions will support this and show you in more detail how this is done. The way that I do it is I mark the midpoints just at the top and the bottom, because I don't want to get confused. Often I've seen people at workshops sewing these lines if they mark them. So instead of marking the lines, I just mark my midpoints because they have to be exactly right again. And then once I have those midpoints in place, then I mark both diagonals, again very carefully, from corner to corner in both directions. So that's that prepared. Marks top and bottom, left and right, those will be our cutting lines, and the X is for our sewing lines. And then make sure the 2 squares that are right sides facing, right side of this fabric facing right side of this fabric, are absolutely lined up all sides and all corners, and that is so important. And then again, you put in a couple of pins to stop that alignment from slipping off course as you sew. The rest of these are the different fabrics that we use to make the 4 patches, and these will all be stitched together right sides facing in pairs. I always keep the lighter fabric on the top, so I have all of these guys ready to stitch in their pairs right sides facing. So I'm going to take all of those components, my strips, my large half square triangles and my small half square triangles, over to the sewing machine next to show you the next part of how to make this block. So now I've taken all these pieces over to have them ready beside me, and now I'm about to sew. And now I sew a 1/4 inch on either side, not on the line, but a 1/4 of an inch away from the line on both sides, sticking to a very consistent 1/4 inch seam. And it can't be a generous 1/4 inch seam. It needs to be, if anything, slightly shy of a 1/4 inch seam. This is a very old sewing machine. One side done, I turn around and I go back and on the other side. And for a half square triangle, we just do that once. Then we go to the small ones where I'm doing a group of 8 half square triangles. And so the diagonal in one direction. Now that is my sewing, stage 1, complete on all of these. And then I have some pressing and cutting to do before I can go on to stage 2. So at this stage, we go to the ironing board. I'm going to press and cut my half square triangles first. And I find I get a much better result after I've stitched to set that seam, press it again before I take and cut it. So you can see now the 2 stitched lines on either side of the marked yellow line. Take my pins away in case they destabilize the ruler. Set the ruler on and cut through my yellow line, and before I move anything I check whether it's released. And because I'm on the ironing board, I have to apply a bit more extra pressure. And now I can release. And I have 2 half square triangle sets here. Press, set them, open flat right the way into the stitch line, and press. It's a 3-stage process. Set, open flat, and press. And once that's done, you can trim these corners, and that's the first part of the block complete. Set those aside for a moment. Our next one, slightly more complicated, is our set of 4, rather 8, 4 pairs, 8 individual half square triangles of the marked line. 1/4 inch away from the marked line is the seam. So I have 2 seams run across, 2 seams running that way. Now when you're coming to cut these, you cut your vertical and horizontal lines first, not the marked lines. So you want to find those absolutely precisely, because these are going to be the outside edges of your half square triangles. And if you don't get these right, your triangles, your HSTs, your half square triangle squares, will never be the right size. So that's it at the top, that's the bottom, and you can use your ruler to check that you're right. And once you have those done, and only once those are done and clear, you can then individually cut the marked lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And finally, our long strips. This is the technique that you may not have seen before, and it's one, as I say, I've developed myself for making small 4 patches. Keep the lighter fabric on the bottom, keep the seam away from you, set the seam with the heat from the iron, and then push back, so that you get a nice, clean, sharp line. And then a second one of the same combination. And the one I'm going to show you is this dark combination because you can see it so clearly. Set, push back, press. Set. Now, any lesson that I've ever been taught tells you now to subcut these and sew the pairs together. But that involves an awful lot of using your thumbs. And our thumbs, as we get older, don't like to be used too overworked too much. So what I do is I introduce these to each other at this stage, very carefully, with the seams nesting snugly into each other. And I'm going to use a pen for this because the lines are going to be cut, but so that you can see clearly what I'm doing. A first line to trim away the edges, and then at 2-inch intervals and then I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch away from each one of those marked lines. So that's ready for sewing. I'm just going to do one more where there's a variation between this one has a different combination. So this is fabric 3 and fabric 4, which will be combined with fabric 1 and fabric 4. And again, you'll see that in your instruction notes. Set it in with the heat of the iron, encourages it. Nice clear lines. We get 1, 2, 3, 4. And now I sew starting from this side. Feed one through. And then the next. Release the first. Now, and again, before I start to cut these, press to ease out any lumps or bumps that may have been created during the sewing process. So remove this so that my ruler is checking that these are 2-inch wide slices. 1, 2, 3, 4. And each one of those is a perfect 4 patch, as will those be. Press them on the reverse and open that seam at the junction to give you a lovely flat meeting place there at the crossroads. The last remaining pieces that you'll need are these little very, very small half square triangles. So I stack these with the light ones on the bottom always, with the triangle pointing towards me, the stitching line away from me, and that allows me to heat, unfold, smooth and press. Heat, unfold, smooth, press. Takes an awful lot of the stress out of doing half square triangles. And you always get your light fabric tucked in towards the dark. And when you have them done, you trim them, and these should be exactly 2 inches square. If they're not exactly 2 inches square, you trim them, and you trim them with care. Now, before I assemble the block, I want to show you how to trim these little half square triangles, or a half square triangle of any size. You've got your 45-degree line on your ruler. Check on your ruler, you will find one. Place that onto the divider line between the 2 triangles in your square, and then trim off anything that you don't need on those 2 sides. It might only be very tiny, but it will make a difference. Then turn this completely around and repeat. 45-degree line in place, square here, and trim off anything you don't need. And now this is the right size to introduce into your work, and that goes in there. So we will have a 4-patch here. Once that's assembled, we create a bigger 4-patch. Once that's assembled, we sew 4 quadrants of the block together. So I've got one 4-patch completely made here. That was made up of a plain square and a 4-patch twice. On the reverse, the light is pressed towards the dark. So where the seams meet, they'll be going in opposite directions, so you won't get a build-up of bulk. So that will be a 4-patch, made up of 4 patches. All of these elements now will go together to make the block. Inner corner of the block, creating the small 4-patch that makes up that inner corner. We sew them together, 2 horizontally and then another 2. So we're sewing the vertical midline, and I use a thread saver afterwards so I don't have to waste thread. And there's a little chain there which is 5 or 6 stitches long that prevents the seams from opening again while we're working on them. Also holds everything in place, and I'm showing you there where one seam is pressed to the left, the other seam is pressed to the right, and join those 2 together, making sure that center junction is snug. I'm taking it there to give it a bit of a press to make it right just before I sew it. And there, one seam left, one seam right, and back in to sew what is the horizontal line through that 4-patch. Thread saver back in, trim away any excess, and that corner 4-patch has been put together. But there's a build-up of thread, and the little chain loop that was so useful before now becomes redundant, so you trim it away, leaving that junction nice and clean. Allow you to open it. Click that center seam open by pushing the right hand section away from you, pulling the left hand section towards you, and the 4 seams within the 4-patch will rotate anti-clockwise around the center junction and give you a nice flat area where they all meet in the middle. Now you can proceed to sew the next 4 elements together to create the bottom right hand corner of the block. And again, we close those pairs of squares over, and I always think of it as if I've just finished reading a book and I've closed the book and I want to sew down along the spine. That keeps me right in my head that I don't sew across the top, I don't sew down the left hand side or across the bottom. I sew where the spine of the book would have been if I just finished the book, and that way it prevents me from getting the seams in the wrong place. But by all means put pins in to keep you right. I don't use pins very often because I've got used to doing it without pins, but anyone that's doing this for the first time, certainly use pins and use them well. I put my pins in at 90 degrees to the seam that I'm going to sew, so that they're always pointing to the area that the seam that I was about to sew, and I can remove them as I need to remove them. They don't get stuck underneath the stitching foot. So now I've got my 4 elements being stitched together, carefully making sure that center junction matches. Back goes my thread saver, snip the chain and smooth it flat. Now, in an ideal world, at this stage, once this block is folded, opened flat rather, and pressed. As I'm saying, don't try to snip it, you trim it. Trim it horizontally. This square really would have benefited from a good trim. But I'll let you in on a secret that as I was filming this with my daughter, I was also cooking Sunday dinner in the in the gaps between takes. So I neglected to come back, and you can clearly see there's a tail sticking out there that I had intended to trim. So trim each of the 4 quarters as you make them to an exact 6.5 inch square, always keeping the center crossroads centered within that 6.5 inch square. And in order to do that, use your ruler to make sure that your center lines are always 3.25 inch from the outside lines. Now I am just showing yet again how that center seam junction should nest in the middle. And that applies for a 4 patch, should it be a tiny 4 patch or a very big one. You always want that center seam to be absolutely exact, centered, and the elements meeting at that center junction. I think I mentioned how old the machine was. That's why we're taping this way, because the machine makes such a big noise. Trim again. We don't need that chain anymore. It's done its job. And any excess threads, loose threads, stray threads, anything like that, have a bin at your feet as you're sewing or as you're pressing, and get rid of them as you go. Just keep cleaning up as you go, because they're never going to be a help. And there's nothing worse than a big dark thread stuck in behind a light patch when your quilt is finished and you see it and you go, oh, how did that fella get in there? Like a worm in underneath your lovely clean white squares. So now we've all the 4 elements, 4 quarters are finished, and we're ready to do the final sets of seams that complete the block. And the silence without the machine is strange. There we go. Always check as you go that the seams, not only the seams that you can see on the top, but the seams that are in underneath, haven't flipped and turned back in the wrong direction on you. You've been very careful all the way through to make sure that your seams are lying flat. If one of them twists, that whole, all that effort that you've put in to keep them flat will be wasted if one of them slips. So here we go, light behind the dark. And you see there, the light in particular, anywhere we can, is tucking in behind that dark navy. And that prevents there being a shadow of the dark fabric showing out through the light element. And then back to iron yet again. And you can't iron too often, and you sew a seam and then iron it, sew another seam and then iron it. Don't try to sew half a dozen seams and then do all the ironing at the one time. It won't work. Now here I do finally and I'm ready to trim that last chain away, open flat, rotate my seams, one final press of those last 4 seams, paying special attention to where they meet, where that little tiny 4 patch is. And now you can clearly see the diagonal of dark navy blue squares that will frame the full centerpiece of the quilt. Now you can see the effect that these 4 blocks that we've just made, the Crossroads blocks, have now that I've put them on the design wall, and in between them I have put the Bargello, which we will be working on next month. In the Bargello you can see all 8 fabrics from the lightest to the darkest. There's several different ways that this Bargello can be arranged, so you will be able to play around with that design and maybe create a look of your own. So we look forward to doing that next month. Good luck with the Crossroads blocks. If you have any trouble at all, send me a message or an email and we'll be talking to you. Thank you.